Hello and welcome to this Wednesday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea, March 16th. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on issues facing Korea and the world.
We certainly will. We are going to start with the Omicron outbreak in South Korea that only appears to be getting worse, and experts say, hopefully anyway, that it's quickly approaching its peak. Daily infections have been in the six-figure range now for weeks, and the country is set to pass the 8 million mark in total infections any day now.
For more on the situation and where South Korea goes from here, we turn to our Han Sung-woo, who joins us live in the studio. Good morning, Sung-woo.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. But we hear that COVID-19 tally for today is going to go up dramatically. Tell us more on that.
The 400,000 range, actually, and that's right. I mean, this isn't even the final tally even. We'll be seeing a record high of possibly close to 500,000 once the official numbers come out in an hour or so. Through 9 p.m. Tuesday, Korea time, health authorities logged 441,423 new cases nationwide, up more than 116,000 compared to the same time on Monday, and already over 50,000 more than the previous all-time daily high of some 383,000 recorded over the weekend. The new infections up until 9 were almost evenly split between the capital region and outside, with Seoul and its neighboring Gyeonggi-do province each reporting well over 90,000 cases. Included in the preliminary tally are not only positive PCR tests, but also positive results from professionally conducted rapid antigen tests, which authorities believe is one of the reasons behind the sharp hike, along with the nation's gradual easing of prevention measures and the rapid spread of the so-called stealth Omicron. Health authorities had earlier predicted the Omicron surge would hit its peak sometime between today and the 22nd of March, reaching a daily average of as high as 372,000, before beginning to decline starting next Wednesday. The number of severely ill patients undergoing intensive care reached an all-time high of 1,196 on Tuesday, and that figure is projected to shoot up to around 2,000 by the end of this month or early April. And reports say the government is preparing updates to its social distancing scheme in the coming days.
Yeah,
is that correct, Mark?
Yeah, you're going to tell us more about that, but it really seems right now that the numbers are that high that it's like everyone that we know in our social and family circles has contracted the virus or has it right now. But yeah, tell us more about these updates to the social distancing.
Right, so it's likely officials will be announcing the changes on Friday, a couple of days before the current social distancing scheme, which limits private gatherings to 6 people max and restaurant business hours to 11 p.m., expires this coming Sunday. The country is considering several options for its next scheme to come into effect next Monday, including maintaining the current guidelines, further relaxing them to allow gatherings of 8 max and food establishments to operate until midnight, or even completely lifting the rules altogether. Before authorities make a final decision, though, they'll be holding in-depth discussions with stakeholders, including related ministries, local governments, and of course, medical personnel and business owners who will likely clash on how to move forward.
But I think South Korea is gradually moving back toward normality, right?
That's true. Gradually moving towards normality. That is the perfect expression. It seems that at this point, with over 1.61 million people undergoing at-home treatment, the government has acknowledged there's only so much hospitalizations and antivirus curbs can achieve. Health authorities have even hinted that the risks posed on the generally healthy population may have to be reevaluated.
Around 2,500 to as many as 5,000 people a year die from the seasonal flu. Pneumonia, meanwhile, claims tens of thousands of lives, so there's a need to analyze and evaluate COVID-19's death toll from a comparative standpoint with other diseases.
One example being the government's decision to exclude those with underlying conditions in their 50s from the so-called concentrated bracket starting Wednesday, that's today, to focus more on those over 60 and those with weak immunity.
Right. As always, Sung-woo, thank you so much for your report. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much. Moving on, China's strict lockdowns implemented to curb the spread of COVID-19 there is forcing companies to suspend operations, raising concerns about possible disruptions to international supply chains.
Numerous big tech and automobile giants with operations in the country are having to shut down their factories as millions of Chinese workers have been ordered to stay inside their homes as part of Beijing's so-called zero COVID response to outbreaks, big or small. Victor Flood has more.
While many countries around the world are easing social restrictions and border controls, China is strictly maintaining its, quote, zero COVID approach. It has restricted 24 million residents in the country's northeastern province of Jilin from leaving the region. This comes as China reported over 5,000 new cases on Tuesday, more than double the day before. Against this backdrop, Changchun, the capital city of Jilin province, began its fourth round of mass testing on Tuesday. Jilin City in the same province started its ninth round of testing on the same day. In the financial hub of Shanghai, authorities are battling an outbreak by isolating individual apartment buildings and testing all residents. China's southern tech hub of Shenzhen has also been put under a citywide lockdown after authorities detected 66 new infections. The lockdown of the city, home to the China headquarters of Huawei, is expected to further shock global supply chains. The restrictions have already forced Apple suppliers, including Foxconn, to suspend production until further notice. A COVID-19 outbreak in Shenzhen in spring last year delayed port operations and caused a surge in global shipping rates, eventually contributing to price increases of imported goods in many countries. Moreover, Toyota said Monday that its joint venture with China's FAW Group has suspended production in Changchun City. Volkswagen, which also has a joint venture with FAW, said it has suspended production at its manufacturing plants until Wednesday. Victor Flood, Arirang News.
Vietnam has resumed its unilateral visa exemption policy for 13 countries, including South Korea, as the Southeast Asian country seeks to reopen its tourism industry after next to no foreign visitors. Citizens from countries that are eligible for an exemption are allowed to visit Vietnam for up to 15 days without a visa, regardless of their passport type or entry purpose. Vietnam closed all inbound tourism and halted visa issuance for foreign tourists in March 2020 due to the pandemic. A fourth round of talks between Russia and Ukraine ended a couple of hours ago. The negotiations will continue via video link on Wednesday. The talks come as more crushing sanctions are imposed on Russia for its invasion of its southeastern neighbor. Lee Dae-hyun reports.
A fourth round of diplomatic talks between Russia and Ukraine ended on Tuesday local time, following a pause the previous day. A senior Ukrainian official said talks with Russia on ending the war were very difficult due to fundamental differences, adding there is certainly room for compromise. The official said that negotiations will continue on Wednesday. Both sides agreed to a technical pause on Monday during a fourth round of talks, citing the need for additional work and clarification of individual definitions and working subgroups. Included on the agenda for the resumed meeting was a possible ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, Russia imposed sanctions on U.S. President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the country's other top officials. The move bans them from entering Russia and is a response to U.S. measures against Russian President Vladimir Putin. But Russia's foreign ministry said official contact with the sanctioned individuals would remain open and official relations maintained. However, legislators, businessmen, or experts could be added to the list in the future. The European Union also launched additional sanctions against Russia on Tuesday. They included bans on Russian energy sector investments, luxury goods exports to Moscow, and imports of steel products from Russia. The freezing of assets of more business leaders who support Russia will also be included in the measures. The UK government also said the country will deny Russia and Belarus most favored nation status, which will lead to an additional 35% import tariff on the two countries. Meanwhile, according to the UN, the war has forced more than 3 million people to flee the country to search for safety. The agency added they estimate the number of civilians fleeing could eventually go up to 4 or 5 million. It's said the war is creating a child refugee almost every second, with some 1.5 million children now joining the exodus from Ukraine. The UN also warned that as 9 out of 10 of those fleeing are women and children, human trafficking remains as a very grave issue. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
The United States is warning of unspecified consequences for countries that bail out Russia in its war against Ukraine, with most of the attention being focused on China. US intel agencies say Beijing has been helping Moscow out financially in its time of need, blatantly ignoring international sanctions in the process. Yoon with the details.
The U.S. brought up serious concerns to China, warning of consequences if China helps bail out Russia, when U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met on Monday with China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi in Rome. The U.S. and its allies are putting sanctions on Moscow that could cripple its economy in response to its invasion of Ukraine. Reports say Russia has requested military and financial assistance from China and that Beijing has signaled its willingness to help.
We've made very clear that any country that would seek to attempt to bail Russia out of this economic, financial morass will be met with consequences. We will ensure that no country is able to get away with such a thing.
Also discussed were growing threats from North Korea as Seoul and Washington report signs that the regime could test fire an ICBM in the near future. The U.S. reportedly expressed concerns about the tensions created by Pyeongyang with its recent missile launches and brought up Beijing's role on the Korean peninsula. China is a close ally of North Korea and also a permanent member of the UN Security Council. China brought up the issue of Taiwan, with Yang expressing severe concerns and resolute objections about growing U.S.-Taiwan cooperation. He reportedly mentioned the issues of Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet as well. Experts say that if China does help Russia, it would rapidly worsen U.S.-China relations and intensify a Cold War-like mood in geopolitics, which would also impact North Korea and Taiwan issues. Yoon, Arirang News.
Satellite imagery shows North Korea has placed strips of concrete at its main airport in Pyeongyang, the same location where it fired ballistic missiles in recent weeks. Analysts say it's likely part of preparations for another missile launch in a related move. US forces stationed here in South Korea have enhanced the intensity of exercises for their Patriot missile air defense system. Pyeongyang reports.
North Korea has reportedly laid 2 concrete slabs at its Sunan International Airport in Pyeongyang in what appears to be part of efforts to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. Citing a commercial satellite image taken on Saturday, Voice of America News reports that the North has positioned flat concrete structures in between the airfield's runway and taxiway. It said both are 50 meters wide. One is 220 meters long, the other 100 meters. The North launched ballistic missiles from Sunan Airport earlier this month and in late February, in what it claimed were tests needed to develop a reconnaissance satellite. But this was seen as an attempt to disguise the actual purpose of testing a new ICBM, called Hwasong-17. The concrete structures are seen as a preparation for a missile launch, as previous missile tests used a transporter-erector launcher on top of a concrete base to increase missile capability. This also helps the launcher from getting damaged, as it can get extremely heavy when fully fueled, and puts tremendous pressure on the ground underneath. South Korea's military said it's keeping close tabs on the situation with the U.S.
As for North Korea preparing for an ICBM missile launch and nuclear weapons tests, South Korea and the U.S. intelligence agencies are working together to closely monitor the situation and have a strong defense posture.
Seoul's Unification Ministry on Tuesday urged the North to halt any actions that raise tensions on the Korean peninsula and called for a return to talks. Meanwhile, former White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction, Gary Samore, told VOA News that if the North launches an ICBM, he expects South Korea and the U.S. to respond by resuming large-scale joint military exercises. With Seoul and Washington on alert for a possible ICBM test, the U.S. military flew a reconnaissance aircraft over the Korean peninsula on Tuesday. According to flight tracking service Flight Radar 24, the RC-135S Cobra Ball spy aircraft, based in Okinawa, Japan, flew over the East Sea for around 9 hours before returning to base. Also on Tuesday, U.S. Forces Korea said it has increased intensity of the exercise in the 35th Air Defense Artillery Brigade stationed in South Korea, and released photos of the drills. It said this is to demonstrate its capabilities and commitment to defending the country, and added that North Korea's significant increase in its missile testing activity undermines peace and security in the Northeast Asia region. Pyeonji, Arirang News.
Now it's time for Onpoint, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. Much of the world's focus is on the conflict in Ukraine, but despite the general lack of back-to-back news coverage that we used to see, COVID-19 remains a serious issue in many different countries, not least South Korea, which, as we've been reporting on, is seeing a massive surge in Omicron cases right now. However, countries that have already experienced what South Korea is enduring now are facing yet another wave.
This has many experts pondering whether is this the start of a new wave. They say waning immunity, shifting behavior, and new variants may all be playing a part in the uptick some European and Asian countries. For more on this, we connect to Professor Michael Toole, Associate Principal Research Fellow at the Burnett Institute in Melbourne, Australia. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So many people assumed the rampant spread of Omicron would provide natural immunity against COVID-19, but we are seeing another wave even in heavily vaccinated countries. Why is this so?
Yes. The Omicron surge began in December, and it largely affected Europe and North America. Then, of course, it moved east, and we've seen this year huge numbers of cases in both high and high-income countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and low-income countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. Now, as you said, we're starting to see an uptick in new cases back in Europe. Hasn't begun yet in the US. But in Europe, it's likely due to a number of factors, three main factors. One is this new, what we call a subvariant, or a kind of sister of the first Omicron variant. It's called BA2. It is 50% more infectious than BA1. Secondly is a change in behaviours. In countries like Denmark, all restrictions were dropped, including all mask wearing indoors. Thirdly is the waning of immunity from vaccines, where many people, even in highly vaccinated countries, had their third dose or their booster 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, and they are now less immune to the virus. So 3 or 4 factors there.
Right, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the waning effectiveness of the vaccines, because there have been a number of studies coming out that showing that while the 4th booster shot does kind of boost you back up to where you were straight after the 3rd booster shot, or when the 3rd booster shot was at its most effective, a lot of younger people are thinking, you know, I'm healthy. Statistics show that young, healthy people generally don't get that sick, and certainly a lot fewer of them actually succumb to COVID-19. Is it worth, in your opinion, a more targeted approach, perhaps saying, okay, the younger population don't need to get the 4th booster shot, or do you think everyone should be required to get a 4th booster shot?
Well, first I'll start with the 3rd booster shot. That has shown to be very effective, including against Omicron, at least the first version of Omicron. So 2 studies from the US and UK show that a 3rd dose protects against hospitalisation by about 90%. It's very high. However, 10 weeks later, after that 3rd shot, it goes down to 80%. Still high, but it's showing a direction downwards. The only study we have of the effectiveness of a fourth dose is from Israel. And they found the number of antibodies in your blood did increase, but the protection against hospitalization and death did not change. So at the moment, I think it's not worth giving a fourth dose to healthy young adults, but it is very important in people who are immunocompromised, so people who are being treated for cancer, leukemia, rheumatoid arthritis, and the very elderly. So for younger people, no, I don't think it's necessary, but it is essential that they get a third dose.
Professor Toole, a lot of countries have been moving back to normal. Do you think this change in behavior has also, contributed to the resurgence in some countries? And if so, do you think citizens would accept harsher restrictions?
Yes, as I said before, I think Denmark is a model of what not to do, and that is to ease all restrictions overnight. So we should take a gradual approach. As for reimposing, I call them precautions rather than restrictions. We should start with those we know are effective, but not so intrusive on our lives. Now, Scotland has just reintroduced indoor masks, and that's where countries should start. Social distancing, so density limits in indoor spaces, and something that's been neglected, improving ventilation in indoor spaces. For example, making it mandatory, for example, in a bar or a restaurant, to have a carbon dioxide monitor, to look at the quality of air in that space. So they're the three things that I think we can do that don't actually impose on people's lives and they don't affect the economy. I think it probably won't happen that we'll go back to the complete lockdowns.
And finally, Professor Toole, just quickly, Moderna's CEO recently said that they need to come up with some new vaccine formula for the fall, if possible, that covers all variants of COVID-19. Firstly, do you think that's possible in such a short time frame? And if you think a new variant does emerge, how do you imagine it might look like?
Well, both Moderna and Pfizer are working on a vaccine that responds to Omicron, at least the first version of Omicron. It'll probably take a while, but the mRNA vaccines are relatively easy to modify. As for a vaccine that will protect against all variants, we don't know what the next variant will be. Virologists have been surprised at how much this virus has mutated. Back in the days of Delta, most experts thought the next variant will be related to Delta, but it wasn't. Omicron was a brand new variant. So we don't know what the next variant will be. But there is a lot more investment going on around the world in what we call a vaccine, a pan-coronavirus vaccine that would lead to immunity against particles in the virus that don't mutate. So not on the surface spike protein, but inside. That may take years.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
South Korea's president-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has filled more positions in his transition team, which will prepare for him to take office in May. Two experienced officials who served in previous administrations and a former lawmaker. His spokesperson also said that the incoming administration will change the vetting process for Blue House personnel. Kim Yeon-sung reports.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol is one step closer to completing his transition team. Yoon's spokesperson Kim Eun-hye announced in a briefing on Tuesday morning the names that will lead its 3 divisions. For the head of its Economy First Division, Yoon called in Choi Sang-mok, who was the Vice Minister of Economy and Finance under the Park Geun-hye administration. As an expert in macroeconomics and financial economics, Choi will work alongside President-elect Yoon and try to crack some of Yoon Suk-yeol's top pledges, COVID-19 relief funds, and pension reform. For the Diplomacy and Security Division, former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Kim Sung-han was named. Kim is an expert in international politics with 3 decades of experience. He helped facilitate Yoon's call with U.S. President Biden last week and has been appointed to strengthen the Korea-U.S. alliance. For political, judicial, and administrative affairs, former Assemblyman Lee Yong-ho has been appointed as secretary. According to spokesperson Kim Eun-hye, Lee comes from a journalism background and has proven his political caliber as a chief policymaker for the People's Party. She added that Lee will help restore justice and common sense. But should they end up following Yoon to the Blue House, they will have to get final approval from the police and the Justice Ministry. According to spokesperson Kim, under the Yoon administration, the presidential office will only hold the power to recommend names to posts, and it will leave the final vetting process to the Ministry of Justice and the police. Previously, the Blue House Senior Secretary of Civil Affairs handled personnel, but Yoon's spokesperson said that this had often led to abuse of power. So Yoon plans to shut down that senior secretary office and model his staff hiring on the U.S., where the final screening of candidates is left to the FBI or other authorities so that there's an equal balance of power. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
The U.S. Trade Representative says there's room for improvement when it comes to increasing Washington's automotive and agricultural trade with South Korea. Addressing an event in Washington Tuesday to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the South Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, Catherine Tai said the value of goods and services the U.S. has exported to Korea has grown by over 17% over the past decade to nearly $70 billion US. However, she admitted the U.S. has also grappled with challenges in regards to implementing the agreement.
Now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. Tuesday, March 15th, 2022 marked the 10th anniversary of the South Korea-U.S. free trade deal. A decade in, Seoul and Washington are now widely considered closer trade partners than ever before. Since the agreement took effect in mid-March 2012, the two sides have become key trading partners. Latest data shows trade volume between Seoul and Washington soared over 66%, almost $170 billion US last year from around $100 billion back in 2011. South Korea's trade surplus with the US almost doubled to $22.7 billion in 2021 from $11.6 billion before the FTA. For the US, the deal attracted almost 4 times more investment from South Korea, with the accumulated investment over the past 10 years amounting to around $113 billion. For more on this special anniversary, I'm pleased to say we are joined by Shin Sang-hyuk, who is professor at the Graduate School of Pan-Pacific International Studies, Kyunghee University, and Troy Stangarone, who is senior director and fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning, both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, I'd like to start with you, Professor Shin. Get your thoughts on how successful the FTA has been for both countries over the past 10 years, and also what you forecast the next decade might hold for trade ties between Seoul and Washington.
Well, I think the Korea-U.S. FTA has been very successful. As you know very well, the Korea-USA FTA has played a very important role in significantly expanding trade and investments between Korea and the United States. According to the Korea International Trade Association, bilateral trade volume between the two countries increased 67.8% over the last 10 years. In fact, in 2021, the trade volume, the bilateral trade volume was $169.1 billion. And it was in 2011, it was only $100.8 billion. So USA goods accounted for 13.4% of all products imported into Korea in 2021. Actually, it was only 9.3% in 2011. So USA became the second largest trading partner of Korea. And during the same period, over the last 10 years, Korea's proportion of the US trade rose to 3.5% from 2.7% in 2011. So in terms of trade, owing to Korea-U.S. FTA, the trade volume increased dramatically. In the mutual investment also increased dramatically after the Korea FTA took effect. The U.S. actually is Korea's the biggest source of FTI. FTI stands for foreign direct investment. So out of total Korean FTI, inward Korean FTI, USA accounted for 22.3%. And USA is also largest overseas investment destination for Korean companies. Actually, it accounted for 25.2% of Korea's foreign investment. In terms of the investment owing to Korea-U.S. FTA, there has been a huge increase. And then finally, I want to emphasize this point. Actually Korea-U.S. FTA played a very pivotal role in strengthening cooperation in the supply chain of the two countries. Actually, Korea became a major supply chain partner of the United States based on close economic cooperation through Korea-U.S. FTA. So considering all of these, I think that the Korea-U.S. FTA has been very successful. And then in the coming 10 years, I think both countries have enough reason to hold for, make every effort to maintain or strengthen the trade ties in the coming 10 years.
Yeah, it seems that way. We've been seeing big Korean companies like Samsung, LG, and SK Hynix build big factories and plants in the United States in recent years. So it seems like the future looks bright. Turning to you, Troy, a question along similar lines, I guess, but between South Korea and the United States, do you think that there's one of the economies that do better out of this FTA than the other?
If we look at the trade data, what we see is that this agreement has been beneficial to both countries. If you look at goods exports, for example, the United States and South Korea have similar levels of growth in their exports. If we look at South Korea specifically, its export growth has been slightly larger on the goods side than the United States. But if we turn to services trade, the United States has benefited more on the services side. So on the whole, I think the agreement has been beneficial both to the United States and South Korea, and that those benefits have been shared fairly broadly to both countries.
Yeah, it seems that way, looking at the figures. Back to you, Professor Shin. As we know, the world is changing at a rapid pace these days. Lots of things going on economically and geopolitically. Do you think to ensure the FTA keeps up, do you think certain improvements, revisions, tweaks need to be made? Some argue that there are these newly emerging issues such as the digital economy, carbon neutrality. Should they be incorporated more into part of an upgraded FTA?
Yes, I think so. Already the USA and the South Korean government have signaled the digital economy as an important area to deepen and widen bilateral cooperations, particularly in the emerging technologies and semiconductors and electric vehicle battery supply chain and 5G networks, as well as the technical standards. So if I give you more details, strategic areas of cooperation between the two countries, within these are the key industries. could be included the enhancing private sector cooperation and the R&D and cultivating R&D and facility investments and improving manufacturing capacity and then securing next generation core technologies and strengthening legislation and institutional support. So I think there are enough reasons, needs for both countries to include the digital economy and carbon neutrality as a part of the updated Korea-U.S. FTA.
Yeah, it seems some changes will have to be made, but as with big agreements like this, things take time, of course. Turning back to you, Troy, as we all know by now, it's all we've been talking about for the past couple of years, but the world economy has been through a hell of a time, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement has played a fairly big role in helping the South Korean economy weather the worst, the most severe aspects of the pandemic-triggered financial chaos that we've seen over the past couple of years?
I think the USFTA is an important foundation for U.S.-Korea economic relations. And just very briefly on the last question, I just want to add, I think the growth in U.S.-Korea economic relations, specifically what was agreed at the May 10 summit last year, are all important issues to move forward, but that we're not likely to see a course itself upgraded. If you were to take and in the United States make changes to the agreement, that would have to go back through Capitol Hill if it changed U.S. law. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we need to find ways to work within the existing core structure and potential other agreements, whether it's at some point both South Korea and the United States join CPTPP, whether there is a broader digital trade agreement. And so I think we need to keep this in mind. But to move back to your question, I think the key for South Korea during the pandemic has been not so much the USFTA itself, but actually its own export mix. During the pandemic, we saw a shift to digital working, we saw a shift to remote learning, and all of these things meant that we had an increase in demand for computers, for tablets, for cell phones, for video game systems for people who were staying home during the pandemic. All of this meant that there was a huge demand for semiconductors, which we've seen shortages of around the world now. And South Korea was well positioned to take and provide the semiconductors the world needed for this increased demand. At the same time, you also saw through the pandemic, because South Korea had taken and managed the pandemic well, an increase in demand for goods from South Korea to deal with the pandemic. And coupled with that, you saw with the greater emphasis on climate change, greater demands for electric vehicles, for electric vehicle batteries, and all of these things meant that essentially when the pandemic hit, South Korea was actually well prepared and had a good export mix to take and drive its economy forward during the pandemic. And so I think that was what played a major role in helping South Korea through the pandemic.
Yes, certainly South Korea is known around the world as being a very much export-driven economy, and having this deal in place certainly helped in that regard. Professor Shin, turning back to you. So we've been seeing the global rise of China over the past decade. Do you think this adds extra weight to the South Korea FTA in ensuring that South Korea and China can work together to extract as much value and as much economic support for each other's economies to kind of counter this rising tide of Beijing's growing economic influence on the world stage?
Yes, I think so. China has emerging as a very important actor, not only in the region, the Asia-Pacific region, but also in the world. And as you know very well, a few years ago, the trade war between the USA and China started in the middle of the very high tension in the global community, global trade arena. Pandemic, COVID-19 broke out. In the middle of those kind of situations, I think the global supply chain has been disrupted. In this kind of situation, we can see the Chinese rise as a big actor, not only as an economic actor, but also a political actor. So the USA want to counter the China's growing influences in the global community. As one of the way, certainly strengthening cooperation, economic cooperation with Korea in the name of the Korea-U.S. FTA seems to be very, very important. Because, by strengthening economic cooperations with Korea in the name of the FTA, certainly the USA could increase the influences or the existence in the region as an economic actor. But also, these days, the economic trade issues cannot be separate from the political and security issues. So considering all of these, certainly by strengthening economic cooperation through the Korea-U.S. FTA, the USA will be able to counter the rising Chinese growing influences in the global community. But one thing which I want to emphasize this point, one thing which I want to emphasize is that Seoul will need to carefully balance its relationship with the U.S. and China. South Korea does not want full-scale decoupling and will make efforts to retain some access to Chinese market because Chinese market is very lucrative and very huge. So the government cannot give up the Chinese market. So certainly this is one of the aspects. By strengthening the economic cooperation between Korea and the United States through the Korea-U.S. FTA, they should maximize the economic benefits, which could be very important for both countries. By doing so, certainly, as I said before, the USA could counter China's growing influences, not only in the region, but also in the global community.
And Troy, back to you. Former US President Donald Trump famously labeled the FTA as horrible, his word for the United States, insisting numerous times that it was badly lopsided in Seoul's favor. So a two-pronged question for you, really. Back then, do you think he had some semblance of a point behind his argument? And Trump really has been making strong signals now that he intends to run for president again in 2024. Should he win in a couple of years' time, would you expect him to try and come after the Seoul-US free trade deal yet again?
Well, I think the course FTA has been anything but horrible. Even by President Trump's own standard, which is the trade deficit, the course FTA the trade deficit between South Korea and the United States had begun to decline in 2016. It continued to do so until the pandemic hit. So I think, if anything, by his own metric, this has not been a horrible agreement. Both the United States we've discussed have export levels beyond what they had before the pandemic, all-time highs. We've seen trade grow. This is something to where the agreement has been a strong driving force for both countries. Now, if we look at politics more broadly in the United States, trade is a very difficult topic in the U.S. right now. If you look at the course FTA ceremony that you referenced earlier in your piece and Catherine Tai's remarks, USTR Catherine Tai's remarks on, autos and agriculture, also at that ceremony, she said that this is essentially, FTAs can have a positive role. And this is one of the first times the Biden administration itself has talked about FTAs in a positive sense as well. And so I think this kind of helps to illustrate the challenges you have faced politically here in the United States for trade at the moment. And this is one reason why, if we look at the Biden administration's own trade policy, the Indo-Pacific cooperation that they're trying to build is still very skeletal in its own nature. And so the politics of trade is difficult in the United States. And I think it's even less clear whether President Trump will even be the Republican nominee come 2024. Right now, he's very out of step with even Republicans on the issue of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So you're starting to see more Republicans push back. In my home state of Tennessee, to be honest, President Trump endorsed a Republican candidate, and state Republican leaders are pushing back strong against that candidate and feeling that he doesn't have the right to anoint people to be their nominees. So I think you're starting to see more pushback against President Trump. And so I think there's a lot of open questions about 2024.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the old Trump supporters have kind of jumped off the Trump train, as they called it, over the past couple of years for various different reasons. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But before we wrap up, Just briefly, Professor Shin, I just wanted to ask you, for our international viewers who just might not be that aware, just walk us through what are some of the biggest exports in terms of products and services that flow from South Korea to the United States and vice versa.
Well, the major exporting items, the Korean exporting items were automobiles and components, petroleum products, rechargeable batteries and refrigerators and synthetic resins and things like that. And from the United States, agricultural products and then crude oil and then equipment making for the semiconductors, LPGs and natural gases and the vehicles. And in fact, in the coming 10 years, I think the major exporting items between two countries will be changed a little bit. For example, maybe the diesel and gasoline engine vehicles could be replaced with the electric vehicles. I think there will be some changes, but I think as a whole, there will not be big changes in the trade items between Korea and USA, I think.
Yeah, electric vehicles really are the thing of the moment. Barely a day goes by when I almost don't get run over by those electric cars coming up behind me, making basically no sound at all. Wonderful talking to you both, and hopefully we can speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now for a look at news from around the world, we turn to Lee Seung-jae joining us from the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So let's start off in Peru. A massive landslide there has buried dozens of homes.
That's right. So parts of a hill collapsed in northern Peru on Tuesday, burying at least 60 homes, with images on social media showing entire apartment buildings covered by the landslide. Now, according to local authorities, there have been no confirmed deaths as of Tuesday afternoon, but rescue workers were on the scene searching for people. Now, the massive landslide happened in an area that's home to mine workers not considered safe for the construction of homes. Now, unfortunately, Peru has high rates of house informality, with many homes built on edges of rivers or on the sides of hills prone to landslides. Now, massive protests erupted in India's southern city of Chennai on Tuesday after the Karnataka High Court upheld a ban on wearing hijabs in classrooms in the state. Now, hundreds of protesters, including college students, took to the streets with banners and place cards protesting against the court's verdict.
It's totally injustice what we have got today, and we had so much hope in our judiciary system, in our society and constitutional values, but we are feeling like we have been betrayed by our own country.
Now, the hijab ban last month by the state sparked protests by some Muslim students and parents, as well as counter-protests by Hindu students. Meanwhile, ahead of the latest verdict, Karnataka authorities announced the closure of schools and colleges while imposing restrictions on public gatherings in some parts of the state to prevent a potential violence. Now, moving on, the U.S. Senate on Tuesday approved a proposal to make daylight saving time permanent. While it still needs to be passed in the House and signed by President Joe Biden, a permanent move would mean Americans would never have to set their clocks back an hour and lose an hour of afternoon daylight in the fall and winter. Now, Senator Marco Rubio, the lead sponsor of the proposal, touted a number of benefits to making daylight saving time permanent, including reduced seasonal affective disorder in the late fall and early winter to more daylight for school sports. And finally, the Eiffel Tower has grown 6 meters after a new digital radio antenna was attached to the top of the Paris Monument on Tuesday. Following the addition of the antenna, which was airlifted into place by helicopters, The tower now measures 330 meters tall. While it's known as one of the most recognized landmarks in the world, the Eiffel Tower has also been used for broadcast transmissions for more than a century, with its height changing numerous times as aging antennas were being replaced.
Good morning. Do expect some pretty big temperature swings again today. Things will warm up fast as we head towards the afternoon. Readings overall will be a couple of degrees higher than yesterday. But it's that dusty air again. The capital and Chungcheong-namdo province will have bad levels of fine dust all day long today. But air quality should improve tomorrow along with rainfall. Chilly start to the day across Korea. Seoul beginning the day at about 4 degrees Celsius. Chuncheon at just freezing mark. Sunny skies to start the day nationwide, but thick fog is lowering visibility in western regions, so please drive with care this morning. Highs will be 2 to 4 degrees higher. Seoul going up to 16 degrees this afternoon. Daegu and Gwangju will actually notice about 16 degrees of temperature gaps today, topping out at 22 degrees Celsius. Rain that starts tomorrow will put the brakes on unseasonably warm temperatures. On and off rain looks to continue through Saturday. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That's all we have for now. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Have a wonderful rest of the day. We'll see you at 8 a.m. Korea time on Thursday. And thank you as always for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.